to do first, we have, believe until about 10:45 to be together. What we wanted to do, first of all, is answer the questions that came in yesterday. So I'm going to read, actually some of them were very similar, so I'll kind of bunch some of those together. But we got some great questions, so we're going to take some time to answer those before we get into structure. How do we structure our congregations around the principles and the philosophy of asset-based community development? So I think I'll just read one of these questions, and then each of us will take a stab at answering based on our own personal experiences. So this question is, what are the needs?
They actually wrote boo.
And they did write boo. That surface in affluent communities or neighborhoods. So what are the needs that surface in affluent communities or neighborhoods? Either you want to start or?
Well, I would start with this. So the problems that are present in affluent communities are the same problems that are present in communities that aren't affluent. They are just more invisible. In communities that aren't affluent, those things are just more visible. Though a few years ago, I was asked to talk to an interfaith group about what the biggest spiritual problem in South Bend was. And I said, well, the biggest spiritual problem in South Bend is the poor don't believe they have any gifts and the rich don't believe they have any needs. Yeah. Do you have a, Rachel?
I was going to say that.
Oh.
I mean, I think, one of the things that I talk about as it relates to affluent communities or the suburbs is the desperate need for community. As Mike had alluded to, like, it's hard to see, because many affluent communities believe that they are self-sustainable, but I believe it's When Helping Hurts, that book, that unpacks for us poverty, but different layers of poverty. I think a lot of times when we talk about poverty, we talk about material poverty only. But there is relational poverty, there is poverty in relationship to God, relationship to how we engage with creation and one another. So I think when we look at affluent communities, we can't just say, well, everything's okay here because people have money. That's a lie. And we all know that. So as leaders, it's our job to help uncover and help people see that there are needs, but absolutely there are assets that exist within the communities. So I think helping people see that they have a desperate need for community, just like anybody else. And I was talking to someone a couple of nights ago about this, where they said in their community, people drive into their driveways, into their garages, close the door. People aren't really outside. So it's up to us to find those spaces where people are hungering for community. So where I live, we don't have any coffee shops, right? This whole idea of third space. We don't have those. So we had to create those. And if you're in a more under-resourced community, you have an opportunity to help create that. But in affluent communities, you have coffee shops, you have gyms, you have spaces where people gather. And in those spaces, I'm sure you will find people who are hungering for community, right? So I think if you're just present in those places and connect with people in those spaces, I think some beautiful things could happen.
I just thought about a couple of other things with this, Darren. Once, in Indianapolis, a friend of mine came to me and said, he goes to a affluent church in the suburbs, and he said, this guy came in to speak, and he said this amazing thing, and we've all been talking about it. And I said, what did he say? He said, man, we've been posting about it on social media. It's appeared everywhere. It's awesome. And I said, what was it? And he said, this guy said, even good people fail. And I thought, wow. If that's news, that's a tough place to serve, because we'd have to be so disconnected from our own sense of, awareness and failures and different things. So I would say that. The second thing is, some friends of mine and I, of course, talk a lot about the application of asset-based community development in more affluent communities. And one of the things is, in congregations and communities that are more affluent, they are often involved in mission with people in low-income communities and have varieties of ways they do that, like my friend at Carmel St. Mark's United Methodist Church on the north side of Indianapolis, they have a team that comes and cooks down at Fletcher Place a meal once a month. And so we were talking about what would it look like to do asset-based community development from this affluent, from the position from being in this affluent congregation. I said, well, you know people in your congregation who are really good at discernment, who are really good listeners and paying attention. So why don't you go to that? Why don't you have those listeners go for the next 4 months, go to the Fletcher Place meal and sit and listen to people. Don't go serve, don't go do anything. Just sit and talk with people and listen. And then come back and talk with you and the leadership in the church about what you heard about people's gifts. And then see if there's some way to make connections between the people you met there and the people in your congregation. So that's another way I thought of it.
Well, and I wanted to say something more about in affluent congregations, people don't recognize, the issues that they have, the problems. And, Mike and I had a few times did joint sermon, and we did a sermon once where we talked about the struggle each one of us had. Right. And after the service, someone came up to us and said, who had come from a different congregation and was like, wow, I had a pastor who was actually willing to stand up and said they struggled with something. I don't remember what it was. Do you remember what it was?
I don't have any problems.
You don't have any problems now. But I feel like, as clergy, you don't have to stand up. It wasn't like this overly vulnerable thing that we did, but as clergy, do you give space to allow for people, it's okay to be broken. It's okay to struggle with, mental illness. You have people in your congregations that have mental illness and struggle with addictions. And is that being spoken of in a way that people don't feel shame and guilt around it? And I think that's part of what, we have tried to do over the years at my congregations is relieve people of that shame and guilt, but you have to talk about it. And if you don't talk about it, then people won't talk about it.
So good. I think one of the greatest lies we believe as clergy is that we have to present ourselves as invincible, as like we have it all together. That we are like okay all the time. So I think there's power in kind of like taking off the cape, take off the cape and say, look at my brokenness, look at my scars, look at my wounds. And I think we might start to see some vulnerability in our communities as well. For those of us in affluent, any community, I think when the leadership models vulnerability and using wisdom,
Using wisdom with it. Well, Nadia Bolz-Weber said that you preach from your scars, not your wounds. So things that you've already worked through and overcome, you speak from that. But if you're currently wounded on something, you don't stand up there, and speak from that. But
So that's great. Thank you for sharing that. All right. So next question. Actually, a few of these were pretty similar, and it really spoke to how do we practice asset-based community development when someone is in crisis, right? So one of the questions here was, how does somebody? Here's what. How do you look for abundance when it's 11:30 p.m. and someone's locked out of their car with a baby outside in the cold and their battery is dead without helping with money? And then the second one that's very similar. How does someone who is bound up in addiction and poverty, who can't pay their electric bill or feed their family, whose needs are so great, find a way to produce and give back to set another free? They don't care about the other. Do either of you want to touch on that?
Sure. The second one, I'll take the second one first. So, these are both tied together in a way. There is things about some immediate crisis, like you say. There are times when we are called to act right now in that moment. It's like anything else, what is the spirit that's at work here in this moment? So that's one thing I want to say. The second thing I want to say is the only two choices sometime are not to do nothing or to do what we've always done before. So, for example, if somebody came to me 11:30 at night and locked out of their car with their baby, and the only two choices are not get a hotel room or do nothing. So there's friends in our parish, people who live in our parish, who've been in difficult times before. I took this woman out to lunch in our congregation. Her name's Trina, she's been evicted at least around 20 times in our neighborhood. Now, if I were to get evicted, I don't know what I'd do. But she knows exactly what to do. So I took her out to lunch and I said, so when you get evicted, what do you do? How do you figure out? She says, well, we gather the family all together and then we talk about it and we say, who has room? Yes, we do this. So I started thinking about, there's a lot of people in my parish who know what to do in desperate situations a lot better than I do. So when somebody comes to me in a desperate situation, in a crisis situation, because of the way we do ministry, where we're paying attention to the abundance in the lives of people around us, I have a whole cadre of people I can call and say, let's get together. Could you take this woman and her child in for this evening? And I know, because I've checked out with them, and I know these people over history and time, and we've done all sorts of checks with them, that they're safe people. But it's because when we begin to see abundance, we see abundance everywhere. And that means abundance of people who know how to respond to crisis situations in a lot of ways, a lot better than me, that invites people into community with others.
Well, and the only thing I wanted to add is most of the phone calls that I get, and I'm guessing this happens to most of you, are people calling saying, I need some money for X, Y, and Z. And my response, because most of them I don't know who they are, and I'm like, my response always is, come in and let's talk. It starts with the conversation. And that's what we started to do at Broadway when I told the story of Francis. You come in for assistance, let's sit down and have a conversation. It starts with that. And almost overwhelmingly, the phone calls that I get and I say, come in and talk to me, they never come in and talk to me. But it starts with the conversation. And from that conversation, as you said, Mike, you can do X, Y, and Z, which might be different than just solving an immediate need that somebody might have.
Absolutely. So I had two situations recently. One is with a family facing eviction. They live 2 blocks away from me. It's a grandma who has her children with her, and then she's taken her oldest daughter. She has her kids. So a lot of kids in the house facing eviction. So the question is, what do we do? We don't. Not only do we don't want to see grandma outside. We don't want to see the babies on the street as well. So what we did was, there is a family in our church that has always said, hey, we have space if you ever come across a situation where a family's in need. So I reached out to that family to make sure that they were still willing to do that. It's one thing to say it, but when it comes down to it, like, are you really, really willing to have a family in your home, right? But then also what we did was I reached out to the landlord because I had done some work with the landlord before. And because we view the landlord and that whole, the housing as an asset to the community, we were able to negotiate some things as a result of the relationship. So that's why asset mapping and knowing your community is so crucial. Because there are times when you can help families stay in their homes for a certain amount of time and get things worked out with the landlord and get finances figured out in order for them to stay. So this family is still in the same house, because we were able to work with the landlord, but we also have space available if anything else was to happen. But my wife and I are going to start doing some financial counseling. There's some other folks in the church who are really good with numbers. I'm not, but we may have to just pass that on real quick, all right? But just knowing the gifts of the people in the community. Some folks who have extra space. There are some folks who are good with numbers. We know the landlord, and we've just done that work of cultivating community. And I use the word cultivate intentionally because it's a work in process. Relationship building, it's not, I think a lot of times we want immediate results, but this work takes time. So these relationships have to be cultivated. Another situation, we had there's a young woman that my wife and I know. She has 2 children, and both of the fathers of these children have been murdered. Most recently, about a month ago, her baby's father was killed by police officers in his backyard while the police were looking for somebody else. He had absolutely nothing to do with the situation. He was in his backyard. The police were looking for someone else, and they killed him, right? So when we went to the funeral, and as we were talking to the mother, she basically was just like, I don't know if I can go on anymore. I'm having really bad thoughts. So what we did, we invited her to church. And the reason why we invited her to church is because if she came to church, she would be connected to a broad network of people who will love her. So when she came, and I applauded her for even showing up, because that took courage. But she showed up, and I was able to connect her with another mother in our community who has been through similar things, but decades ago. So I was able to connect them. And now my wife and I have kind of just let that happen, and now we found out that they're hanging out together, that this older mother is taking both of her children so that she can rest and be, so just doing this work of connection. So I think a lot of times we get stuck on, well, what if the needs, what about the crisis moment, right? And yes, we have to take care of people, and there are times, there may be moments where it's like, okay, there are no other options. So we need to put someone in a hotel, and we need to, those things are a reality. But I also want us to how do we help to cultivate community, cultivate relationships inside and outside the church so that when crisis arrives, there is a network of people. And so you as the clergy, you as the pastor aren't always the center of everything. But you're also able to spread out the responsibility to others in the community.
Rachel just whispered in my ear, that's a great answer.
Thank you.
May I say one other thing, Daryl, to one of the questions that you asked there? It said something about how can you notice the abundance when somebody is so overwhelmed by things? Yes. And I just want to say that's one of the wonderful things about paying attention to the abundance in people's lives is in the midst of crisis, when you're asking people about what they care about, what they love, what the people who love them say about them, it changes the conversation. And you begin to discover because, well, look, we're in this beautiful building, right? You look around, the people who built this were amazing, but they were also people who had problems. Do you know how I know that? Because they're human, that's right. There are people who struggled with depression. There are people who but they were good at building buildings. There are people who had addictions and other things, but they were good at building buildings. The problems we have aren't the only definition for us.
And there was a woman who was a part of this circle of women who gathered together. They were low-income women. It was a part of kind of this project we tried to do at my church based on a larger work that this organization in San Francisco was doing called Family Independence Initiative. So these low-income families gathered together, and they kind of developed their own goals, and they worked together and support and encourage each other. And one of the women in that group, they all were low income, but one struggled with addiction. And she was like the best person in the group. She knew all the resources in the community, and they all helped one another out. But so just because she struggled with, addiction and was low income didn't mean she didn't have something to offer, other folks.
And that was really important because when we offer something, when we believe that other people know and see that we have something to offer, that is part of our healing. Because that's what we're called for in this world, to be useful to one another.
Yep. Absolutely. Okay, next question we have here is, most of these stories seem to be leadership intensive. As a part-time clergy with another job, how do we answer the great need, boo, of the time?
They wrote that.
They wrote boo. How do we empower our congregations to do this work?
So the first thing I think about this is, so I realized one year around Thanksgiving time that the local homeless shelters and others often did a lot of big push during Thanksgiving and Christmas time, right, for support. And one of the things that I thought about on Sunday morning is the scripture was from Isaiah, who says, take the homeless poor into your homes, right? He says this. But I wasn't going to ask people to do that. What I wanted to know is who has done that. So I'm going to ask you the same question I asked them, which is that morning I said, how many people in this room have ever taken someone into their home, either a relative or a non-relative, and had them live with you for a while who, if they wouldn't have been staying with you, would not have had a place to lay down their head? Have any of you ever done that? Look around the room. Look how many hands. That was what happened at Broadway on Sunday. And I realized I had never said before to people, God bless you. You have been doing good and holy work. How does it become multipliable? By people seeing and recognizing that other people are doing it. We had everybody who'd done that come forward, and we anointed them with oil and said, thank you. When you did this, you did what the prophet Isaiah is talking about.
Well, and I have a woman in my congregation, after reading Mike's book, decided that she wanted to get to know her neighbors better, which was part of what this is all about. And, you know, so in the summertime, she's got a lot of fruit trees and has an overabundance of fruit from the fruit trees. So she gathered those up and just went to her neighbor's house and knocked on their door and said, I have something to offer to you, and, you know, as a way to connect with her neighbor. And
I bet the Good Neighbor movement people here would
the
really
Good Neighbor
like
movement
us.
people here, yes, would love that. And she continues to do that in different ways. And I think that does happen more often than we actually recognize.
And I think it happens overwhelmingly in the lives of the laity of our congregations.
And I would just say, for me personally, so of the probably 4 or 5 years I've been doing this work in my neighborhood, I only got paid for one of those years. So I've always had to, you know, for 4 of the 5 years, I've had to work another full-time job. So there are things that we can do. We can do this work and still work another job at the same time. It's not an issue of like adding more to our calendars. How do we be intentional with what we have? And how do we see the relationships and the people that are right before us? This is the same idea around missional engagement. This isn't about doing more things. It's about being intentional with the relationships that we have. So at my congregation, like we don't have staff, right? You know, someone asked me a few nights ago, who is my leadership team? My leadership team are my neighbors. So my worship leader is a lady that we met a number of years ago in the community. We started doing meals together, invite her into discipleship in our home on a Sunday morning. You know, our hospitality leaders are folks they throw great parties in the neighborhood. And I said, hey, would you all want to lead hospitality at the church? And they were like, sure, we don't know how to do this. And I said, neither do I, but we'll figure it out, right? So I think we have to get out of the mindset of full-time paid clergy in order to do this work. But I think I call it missional imagination. I think as clergy, we need to grow our missional imagination and ask God and ask the Spirit to lead us to see our communities and people in fresh new ways, so that we can ask different questions, ask questions that will help to open up the storehouses of abundance, right, rather than to be focused in a deficit mindset. So I just wanted to say that as somebody who doesn't get paid, right? All the stories I shared, that was while working 50 hours a week, right, at another job. There's things that we can do that don't take full-time paid clergy to do. So hopefully that makes sense.
Actually, one of the things...
Haven't you done worship in a different way? Haven't you gone out into the community? Right?
Yeah. So you would, yes. I have a picture of that. I guess we can go there right now. Speaking of structure. Mm-hmm. Please show that slide. I see it in front of me. I don't see it behind me. So if everyone can come up on stage. There we go. So this is a picture I think I shared about the cash mobs that we do. So as a result of, I'm sorry I talk so much about homicides, but that's just where I live. So as a result of 2 young boys being killed in their home, my wife one night, after this happened, she said, so what are we going to do about this? And I looked at her and I said, nothing. I was serious.
Grieve.
Right. I was like, I'm just like, what is there to do? And so after we talked so much, and she challenged me on like, okay, so if we're really about the community, when this happens, we have to do something. So we just decided, let's go to these spaces and pray. And let's minister to the families. Let's just go and be present. So what we did, and this is a couple of years ago, we would put our kids in strollers, because our church kind of came as a result of our engagement in the community. We helped start play groups and different things for families. So our church has a lot of young families in the community. So we would meet in the parking lot of a bank, just to this idea of like using the time that we have and not trying, being intentional. So instead of worshiping on a Sunday in a building, we said once a month we're going to go and pray through our community. So we met in the parking lot of Arvis Bank in our community, and we would go and go over to this picture. Shows us in front of Blankenship Beauty Supply. So what we would do is go to how this all started is all our kids had to pee at the same time. So this is how, I'm just keeping it real. We were like, we're gonna go pray, and all our kids were like, we need to pee. So we went over to Mr. Blankenship's business on Sunday morning and said, hey, Mr. Blankenship, all 20 of our kids need to pee. What do we do? And he said, well, I have a restroom, you can use it. Ever since that time of him opening up his restroom, which was an amazing asset that day, once a month, we would gather in front of his business, and Mr. Blankenship would come out and pray with us. So this picture you see right here is a Sunday where we were supporting Colin Kaepernick's kneelings. So this was our kneeling. So everywhere we prayed in the community, we would kneel, we would take a knee and pray as a mark of solidarity in the face of injustice. So there's a kind of like a turquoise bluish shirt in the middle right there. That's Mr. Blankenship. When I went to his business that morning, I said, hey, here's what we're doing. We're praying for the community as we do each month, but we also are going to be kneeling for justice. And Mr. Blankenship's like, oh man, I'm going to tell you a story. He said, there was one day I had a meeting with the chief of police, because Mr. Blankenship is connected. Like this business is like 50 plus years old. So he's having a meeting with the chief of police. He comes back to his business, and I guess the police were looking for someone that fit his description. So they had him face down on the ground. This is right after his meeting with the chief of police. Had him face down on the ground, guns to the back of his head, and he just said he was so violated. He felt so disrespected. So he tells me that, and he's like, I was in my best suit, and they ruined my suit, right? So he said, as a result of that, I'm going to kneel with you. So that's what this picture is. It's a picture of us being out in the community, getting to know the assets of our community as a result of our kids needing to pee. But whatever. However we learn the assets, we'll take it. Right? And us kneeling. And what was beautiful about it, you can't see it in this picture, but there were people in the community who were pulling up because they needed their beauty supplies. They saw what we were doing, and they joined us. This is the power of connection in our communities. Thank you for reminding me of that.
The other thing I was going to say about structure and what you did as an example of this is if we structure our lives around abundance rather than scarcity, yes, it means we do new things. But it also meant we had to stop doing some things. You changed worship once a month, right? And you didn't just add something on top of everything you were doing. The hard thing usually is not doing the new thing. The hard thing is finding the space to do it by stopping doing something else. That's the real challenge.
Okay, so we have 2 more questions. So this one is, what would you do when an immigrant who are not allowed to, what would you do when an immigrant, what would you do with an immigrant who is not allowed to work? They can't work without being paid. We have done a lot already, given food, money, gas cards, so what do you do to help? This is more of the immigrant community. What does that look like?
Right. I know that in Lincoln this is an issue. I know in rural communities in Nebraska and Kansas this is an issue. I think in the local high school here in Lincoln, I think there's something like 47 or 53 different languages spoken, I think. So a lot of an immigrant community. I think it's the same thing we'd say any other place. first of all, there is an economy. There is an economy going on there, and you find out the economy and you find ways to join it and be a part of it. How do you find the economy? By listening to people's gifts, by paying attention to it, by saying, hey, can I be a part of that? In my neighborhood in South Bend, it was an immigrant community in there as well, and one of the things I discovered after a few years there was people were renting restaurants out of their kitchens. I didn't know that was going on. And you went to it by invitation. It was a by invitation only thing. But, you'd sit in somebody's kitchen, given a menu, which was not usually incredibly extensive. There were usually 7 or 8 things on there. You'd choose whatever. They'd cook it right there and then delivered it to you right there, and you'd eat and pay for it. So even in immigrant communities where people can't officially be paid, there are economies.
Absolutely.
I don't know what you all would say to this, but
Absolutely, I would say something very similar. So, the local economy, and in doing work to find the immigrant communities wherever you're located. So, I think moving beyond the one individual immigrant, can't get. How do we take ourselves out of the center as the church? I know many of your network leaders got the Green Book. And I just addressed that because there are a lot of resources out there. But what's really helpful about the Green Book is it's a collection of stories of neighborhoods who had been already doing this work. And I think one of the diagrams in the book, it kind of gives you a picture of all of the institutions. So it's an asset map of a community. And one of the assets is the church. And I think we just have to get out of the mindset that we are the asset of a community. There are many other assets. So finding the associations of immigrants and connecting to them, learning from them, which is a whole nother conversation. Many times we don't want to learn from anybody, but I think we could learn from them and then get those folks who come into your community who don't have any connections, get them connected. Because absolutely, like the block that I just moved off, there were probably four households on that block. They were all Mexican families, but they were deeply connected, and they supported one another. And what I loved to see was that they would bring other family members up from Mexico. Once the house got too full and able to raise enough money, they then bought another house on the block. Like, talk about asset-based community development. They took care of one another. And they connected one another to resources. So I just think for us in the church as clergy, is just doing our work of learning what's already out there, getting connected, and then being a kind of like a catalyst to then connect those as they need help.
yes, we can often feel like we're on an island when we're thinking it's about us. And the truth is that God has provided abundantly all around us. The question is, are we looking for that and paying attention?
Okay, so the final question, which I think then leads us into more
The structure.
of structure, is what methods helped you gather assets of the community? What
Well,
methods?
So when I first started changing my mind about this, it wasn't my mind that needed to be changed as much as my practices. All my practices, all that I'd learned had been around scarcity. And so when I started, when this woman came to the food pantry and told us she was a good cook and proved it, all of a sudden it was like, oh, this is what I believe. I mean, but I don't have practices for this. So the practices that started were small ones of asking questions and beginning to look at it a little differently.
At your food pantry in South Bend, you had a questionnaire they had to fill out, right? Like
Right.
a 9-page questionnaire
Right.
that helped identify their gifts.
Right, we did these 10 pages.
Well,
of,
just a little
yes,
too long.
what people's gifts were, which was really long, which I don't use that anymore. What we use now is conversation with people. Again, tell us what you do that's meaningful. Tell us what the people who love you would say you do best. Those are the types of things. It's just really paying attention to people. When you get inside people's homes, when you're going and talking with people and they invite you in the home, then you see all sorts of other things. We know this because we're pastors. We visit people in their homes. When you're in somebody's home, you might see an instrument in the corner and you didn't know they played something. You might see a piece of artwork on the wall or a certificate celebrating the achievement of one of the young people in the household. You might smell something being cooked and think, oh man, that's great. So there's varieties of different ways to do
We
that.
actually changed our Committee on Lay Leadership, which
This
was
is a
hard
United
to change.
Methodist group. They
It
know
is,
what the Committee on Lay Leadership is.
And what we told people they needed to had to do, the folks on the committee, was go out and have conversations, which people are already having conversations with their neighbors, and then come back and share what they heard. And so it started with conversations with people.
Right, though I remember, because we in the church are so used to like being told how something's to happen. I remember this one guy who's always hanging out and talking with people. He's like, okay, how do you have a conversation? And it's like, Mark, you're great at this. But he thought he needed a handbook, right, to tell him about this. Absolutely. We don't realize this stuff is already in our hands.
Yeah, absolutely. But there are some tools, and I know if you, I know there was a resource list. I don't know if it's on the Great Plains website. I think you'll.
It is on there,
on the
yes.
website where there's a list of resources, and then you can also go to the ABCD Institute. If you go on the Institute, which is on DePaul University's website, kind of embedded in there, there are also some great tools that you can use where you can do some asset mapping, some asset inventories. There's resources there for that. And there are also some learning conversations. Even as you walk through your community and have conversations with people, there are those resources there as well. So I think for some of us who this is new, I know this isn't new for everybody. For those of us that are new, sometimes it is helpful to have some tools to get started. And the ABCD Institute website is a great resource for that, where you can get there are a number of publications and how to begin doing this work. And what we did yesterday was just just dipped your toe in that idea of like, what do we have? How do we gather the assets that are among us? And then what could we create from that?
Another source that's online that I'd encourage you is, for those of you who are on Facebook, going to the Learning Trees Facebook page. And the Learning Tree is the group of neighbors around Diamond, who I mentioned before. And they have a lot of videos and also written things up there about them that would provide a lot of ways to think and talk about this. So if you're on Facebook, if you go to the Learning Tree Facebook page, you can find a lot of that.
Absolutely, yeah. And speaking of Facebook, the ABCD Institute has a Facebook page as well. And then ABCD in Action, which are a group of practitioners around the world who are doing this work. You can join that Facebook page and see how different contexts are practicing these principles and this philosophy.
But, when you gather the gifts, make sure you use them.
Yes.
Don't just gather them and then not do anything about it, which has,
Actually, thank you, Rachel, because one of the things that makes me think about is that we have around our place, maybe this would be a helpful resource, what we call the 5 rules to keep from being the agent of the devil in the middle of the church. Yes, you had it in your bag. So there, good. It was here. So that second rule is find another's gifts, talents, capacities, passions, and dreams, and find a place for them in the life of the community. Yes, but to use them, because when my eldest son started kindergarten, I went to the kindergarten and they asked questions like, can you work in can you volunteer in the school office? Yes. Do you know how to use a computer? Yes. Do you have a flexible schedule? I'm a pastor. Yes. Nobody called me, and it felt really lousy. And I realized that if I asked for people's gifts and then didn't try to use them, that would be miserable for them. I hadn't realized it until it had happened to me, but it's really important.
So can we talk more about structure?
Yes.
What does, because we want to help give some tips for when we leave here and get home. And I'm just going to let you all in on a secret. So come listen. I'm not Methodist. Don't tell Bishop.
What?
Don't tell Bishop. So I think it would be great, especially to hear from Mike and Rachel, as we talk structure.
Yes.
I don't know the specifics, right, organizationally, right, of what, because I had the privilege of just starting with a few neighbors, right, so I can do what I want, right, and even though I'm a part of a denomination, they leave me alone, right, so no one's telling me like, hey, you can't do that. So what could be helpful as we talk structure in the time we have there? We're going to end early, by the way, but yeah, as we talk structure, next steps.
So when I initially think of structure, one of the things I think of, what are the occasions, what are the possibilities within our life together for us to make an impact with this? One of them, the one that's most central, of course, is worship. It's when the whole community gathers. It's when we're there together. So worship is a place for that. So is when we gather in committees and meetings. Those are occasions for that as well. So it's whenever we gather, there are chances to think about how we can structure ourselves for abundance rather than scarcity. Are there other ways you think about this, Rachel? And then I can say a word about it. So I would say one thing about, we had the ad board. When I came to Broadway in 2003, we had the ad board meeting. And at the ad board meeting, everybody gave reports. All the committees gave reports. It met once a month in the evenings, and by the second hour, everybody in the room was dead. You know what I mean? I mean, all the energy's gone.
You all get that, don't you?
Yeah. All the energy's gone, and it's like, why are we doing this? It's just killing things here. So we talked about it, and we said, well, we're trying to pay attention to God's abundance all around us. So what would that look like? So some of the lay leadership in conversation with us, we'd been talking about abundance and trying to figure out how to pay attention to it. We decided that we would reorganize our governing council. And instead, we wouldn't listen to reports anymore. As long as whatever body, the trustees, the staff parish, whatever, were doing something within the budget, then they would have permission and whatever to do that. We didn't need to do it all over again, rework the process through the whole governing council. So we divided the meeting into 3 parts, and we met less often. So we would meet for a little longer, but we would meet less often. And we divided it into 3 parts. Broadway Believes, so we would do a little Bible study at the beginning. Broadway Dreams, and I'll say about that more, and it was the bulk of the meeting. And the last part was Broadway Acts. Now, the Broadway Acts was where any decision that had to be voted on came. And we structured ourselves in this way around this because we realized that if we put the decisions earlier in the meeting, we'd never get to the other part. But when we put it at the end of the meeting, the voting went a lot quicker. People were tired, people didn't want to spend a lot of time at that point going over that. So we divided that in. In the Broadway Dreams part, what we would do is we would invite 2 to 5 people from inside and outside the congregation. We would work with them before they came to the meeting to talk we didn't do this at first, but we learned that we needed to do this. We needed to work with them to speak for just like 5 minutes each. And we asked them to talk about what their call was in their lives in the world. So this is lay people, right? What their call was in their lives in the world. So we had like the principal from Crispus Attucks High School came. And one of the things he said in the meeting, I'll still remember, he said, every Sunday here at Broadway, we say our mission. And that mission is, as followers of Jesus Christ, responding to God's love. Our mission as the people of Broadway Church is to be a multicultural Christian community that in its ministry seeks, welcomes, and values all people. He said, I get together with my staff. Whenever we have a meeting of the teachers and the staff at the school, I say to them, I want every student who walks in this school, I want every parent of every child in this school to say, that's a school that seeks, welcomes, and values all people. Well, we had not known that the mission had so ingrained itself in some way into people that they were thinking about it in their workplace and using it. And boy, it was encouraging to the people in the congregation to hear that. We had a local photographer talk about some photographs he'd been taking and the stories that they were telling and why it was meaningful to him. He called them stories of outsider Indiana, right? People on the fringes. So we would have people come and do this. So there'd be 2 to 5 people who would share this. And then we spent the bulk of our time talking about what does it mean to be a congregation that holds these gifts in our hands. Now, rather than talking about, whether the staff parish had made a good decision, we were now talking about what does it mean for us that we know and have these gifted people around us, and what does that mean we do as a church? So that was one of those.
Well, we
things.
just didn't change
No,
the
we
governing
changed a lot
council. We
more.
changed the whole thing because we had like 135 slots we had to fill for our committee structure.
Right, we had,
Or something like that.
yes, we actually had more slots than that, yes. There were about 175 people or so at church, and there were about the same number of committee slots. Yes. We weren't the only church like that, right? Right. So we did away with a lot. Yes, we changed a lot. We just said, if there aren't 3 people who are going to do something anymore, we just won't do it. If there aren't 3 people called to doing something. Actually, the whole thing about that was a little crazy. The chair of the Committee on Lay Leadership, all they spent their time doing was filling the nomination slots. And after my first year there, the chair of it, a young man named Scott Collins, said, Mike, we need to be talking about the larger issues we're supposed to be talking, but we never do because all we're doing is filling the committee slots. So at the next meeting, you come with an idea and I'll come with an idea and we'll talk about it. So I came and I suggested this thing about meeting less often and changing our meeting and not having reports and doing that. And he's like, well, that's a great idea. And I said, no. And he said, what do you mean? I said, no. We'd have to, build infrastructure. It'd have to take a long time. And he says, no. We should do this now. And I said, no, we shouldn't. And so that was on Wednesday. So on Sunday, then the next day, I wrote to the lay leader and I said, Mary, I'm really concerned that Scott's moving way too fast here. I think this is a problem. And she said, no, this is the right time. And I said, no. And then I went to Bible study the next night, and the chair of the governing council, the chair of the ad board was there, and I said, John, I'm really worried about Scott and Mary. I think they're going way off the reservation. I think they're moving way too fast. I think this is a big problem. And he said, no, this is the right time. And I said, no. And so on Monday, Scott called me, and he said, Mike, when I'm driving back from work today, I want to stop and see you. Can I do that? Sure. He stopped by and he said, I've been thinking about it and praying about it since we talked last week. I'm going to buy lunch for all the leaders of the church on Sunday. And I'm going to talk to him about this. And if you want to come and listen, you can. So I showed up.
Well, and it was also, we were doing away with all the program committees.
Right, because if there aren't 3 people
If there aren't 3
committed to do-
people, and we kept finance, trustees, we kept the things you had to keep per the discipline.
The
But everything
structure.
else, yes, but everything else was technically going away as it was.
Right.
Yes.
Well, this is what was suggested. And so he gets together the leaders of the church. Now remember, a lot of these committees had collapsed into each other across the decades, right? So the outreach committee used to be 5 different committees, but they had all collapsed into one outreach committee. But the problem was, though they had collapsed into one outreach committee, they had not collapsed their areas of responsibility. So they still had this long list of things that they were responsible for. So even if they did something in that list, they didn't feel good about that because they were feeling bad about all the things they weren't getting done. So there was no way to win with it, right? So that's what you were talking about, right? So he got together with the leaders. I sat there in the corner and listened, and people were saying, no, this makes sense. They said to him, well, what about this? He said, well, if there aren't 3 people committed to doing it anymore, that won't happen. And they're like, oh, thank God. And so they began to see about this and think about that in a different way. So that's what led to that. So yeah, it was a hard and
People
unsteady
started to
time.
do what they cared about, what they were willing to get off the couch and do, instead of doing what they thought they had to do or should do.
Right.
And that changed.
Right.
the
Instead of being
energy, it
miserable
changed.
about
Instead
it.
of being miserable about doing something they really aren't called to do, but felt like they should do it. Or, a lot of committees would come up with goals that they wanted to accomplish, and they never met them, and then they would feel miserable about it.
Right.
Right.
So we just, in an abundance mindset, it was, how do we build on what God is doing in the lives of people here, not in what they think they should be doing, but in what they are actually doing?
Mm-hmm.
Can you all speak to the whole grieving? And we had talked about that, like when something may have to die.
Yes.
Like, can you speak to that?
Well, I talked about this a little bit at annual conference, but I will say something about it again.
Not that a person has to die, but a thing.
Yes, right.
You're assuming they listened to you at annual conference, Mike.
Yes. So one of the things is, as we started this new structure, we said, how is the entire congregation going to know about it? Not just the leadership. So we said, we're going to have to do something in worship on Sunday morning because that's when the community gathers. So we had created in this new structure a new group that we called the Animators of the Spirit. And they were 3 people, and they didn't have a meeting time, and they would only meet, their only thing about meeting was they would meet when somebody felt called to do something, and the animators would have to meet with them whenever they were available, and the animators would do 3 things. They would ask discerning questions, they would point out where dragons lie, and they would pray for and encourage the people in what they were doing. So, but the animators would also lead us in this celebration and grieving. So the first Sunday that we did this, we had a thrift shop at the church that had run for decades. When I got back there in 2003, it was 80 and 90-year-old women who were running it, and they didn't want to run it anymore, and nobody younger wanted to take over for them. So they stopped running it, and we put in the bulletin, the thrift shop is no longer open. But people kept acting like it was. And by that I mean people kept donating to it. It felt like it was a room this size piled with junk. I mean, people, and we were like, how's this for a year? We put in the bulletin, the thrift shop is no longer open. We put it in bold print. We put it in the place of the call to worship. We put it every place we could think that people could see this, right? And people still, so the first Sunday we did this, the Animators of the Spirit got up and said, well, anybody who's ever worked in the thrift shop, please come forward. And people came forward, and we gave them a gift. And then they said to the congregation, well, those of you who have supported this ministry by donating to it, would you please stand? And people stood, and we said together as a congregation, well done, good and faithful servants. And people knew it was done because together in worship, we had done this. It took us 3 years to bury everything that was dead. But
And what was the last thing that we buried?
the last thing, yes. So one of the lay leaders comes and says, I have an idea. So he told the animators what he wanted. And so the head of the animators, she got up in front of everybody and she said, okay, we want to grieve today one final ministry of this church that's no longer active. Will those of you who've always said we've always done it that way before, please stand? And people stood, and we said together, well done, good and faithful servants. And people laughed. And because they laughed, They knew, they were thinking about it. So it was like 5 months later that one of the pillars of the church came to me and said, Mike, I'm not saying we've always done it that way before, but he said, but because in worship we had done this together. Because we had together grieved and affirmed and things. So it took us a while to do that. It became also the chance for us to celebrate new life and new things happening. So one of the things was we had run a tutoring program for 30 years. Now, one of the side things I would just mention about this is we had run this tutoring ministry for 30 years. It was really good, but every year we ran the tutoring program and the graduation rate in the neighborhood got worse. It did not get worse because of what we were doing. What we were doing was not bad, but we were doing something that we thought needed to happen because we thought we had the contribution to make, right? And that we didn't recognize that people around us did. So Diamond had been doing his roving listener work, and he called me. See, I would get tutors from Meridian Street United Methodist Church and St. Luke's United Methodist Church.
These are churches in the suburbs.
Yeah, Carmel United Methodist Church, these big churches, yeah. And I would get tutors from Lilly Pharmaceutical Company, the largest employer in Indianapolis, and I would get them from the United Way. You know where I never asked for tutors from, though, right? From the neighborhood. That's right. These people are poor. They don't know. So Diamond's doing his roving listening, and he comes to me and says, Mike, you got to talk to Maya. And I said, who's Maya? He said, you got to talk to her. I said, why? He says, she runs tutoring out of her house. She lives 3.5 blocks from the church. She runs tutoring. And I said, well, how? And he says, call her and talk to her. So I call Maya. She's 34 years old. She lives in the house her parents raised her in. She works at AT&T at night, and when she gets up in the summer at 11 o'clock in the morning, the kids from her block come over to her house, and she tutors them. And I said, what do you cover? And she says, I cover everything from phonics to Sophocles. I said, what do you mean? She said, well, if they don't know how to read, we do phonics. If they do know how to read, we do Sophocles. And then every Friday, I have a barbecue in my backyard. And their parents come over and they present what they've learned that week. Now, I should not be saying to her, hey, come tutor in our tutoring program. I should be saying to her, how can we be a part of this amazing work that God is doing with you around with your neighbors? So we invite her to come to church when we're doing this celebration and grieving thing. And she says, okay, but I'm not going to get in front and talk to everybody because I'm too shy. She's lived there for 34 years and she's never set foot in our church. And one of the ways we know that is she sits in the front row. And she comes to the front row and she sits there, and we come to that time of the worship and we ask her to stand, and she stands, but she's standing in the front row with her back to the congregation. And the animators tell people what she's doing and say that she will be happy to talk with people one-on-one afterwards. But then says, Maya, would you remain standing? Well, those of you who will support her with your prayers, your presence, your gifts, your service, and your witness, you recognize those words, right? Your prayers, your presence, your gifts, your service, and your witness, please stand. And people stood. But she didn't know that because she's in the front row and her back's to the congregation. So then, stealing a little bit from the marriage litany, he said, will all of you do everything in your power to uphold and care for this person in her ministry? If so, you answer, we will. And when the congregation says, we will, she does something I can't do this minute because I have pins in my pocket. She jumps up in the air, turns around, and lands on her feet facing the congregation. And two things that had been invisible were visible. We had not known there's people doing this good, holy work all around us. And she had not known there's a congregation of people who want to support and bless what we're up to. That's what you wanted me to tell, right? Okay.
So one of the things that I do in my congregation, we call it good news time. And again, I was able to begin this way, so nothing has died yet, but I'm sure something will have to die. We'll get there. So I'm going to kill some soon. But we started this good news time. So after our time of praise and worship, I just open it up and I say, hey, God has been at work in this congregation and in our community this week. How has God shown up? Right? And when we first started this, I got blank stares, right? And I was okay with, I'm so okay with silence and blank stares. I'm just so used to it. So I just stare right back at them. Right? But what's been amazing over the last 3 years that we've been doing this, at first I would just be the one to share, like, oh, here's how, this week, here's how God showed up for me and my family and for neighbors. But what's so beautiful now is we call it family style worship. So we don't have a children's area where we send the kids off to. We all sit at round tables and our kids are with us in fellowship. And now our children raise their hands to share how God has shown up. Our children raise their hands to share good news, even if it's like, I got my allowance this week, right? We are cultivating celebration in our congregation. These are the same families that go through the same issues that I've talked about. These are the same families that are facing eviction and violence and all these things, but we are learning to cultivate celebration as a congregation. Not only in the space, but in the week. Because when we come together, we celebrate what God is doing among us, but also how has God shown up in the neighborhood this week? So that's something that we have done. I think that's something really simple that we can do. Again, I don't know what your structures look like, but what would it look like for you to create space for celebration as you are gathered?
So this led to an interesting thing when Rachel and I were working together. We created a game at Broadway, and it was just among the clergy at first, and you could score a point for encouraging someone, for celebrating the way God was active in their life, for going to their workplace and laying hands on them and blessing them and thanking for them for the people that they had touched and the way in which they were living out the biblical mandate and how they were doing this. So we were playing this game. And we, whoever scored the most points in a month had to buy cupcakes for everybody else. That was how we played this game. So we're playing this game, and some of the lay people said, what are you guys doing? And we said, well, we're playing this game. And they said, well, can we play? And we said, well, we can share. So we shared it with the governing council, what we were doing. So on the following Sunday, during the time when people were sharing celebrations, right? The chair of our governing council stood up and said, Margaret, over here, would you stand up? Margaret, I want everybody to pay attention to Margaret here. Margaret, whenever anybody moves into her neighborhood, Margaret goes over, greets them, takes them on a walk around the neighborhood, introduces them to her neighbors, introduces them to the shops where people can do shopping in. When Margaret does that, she is doing what the Bible talks about welcoming strangers. And I just want to say that's a good and holy thing. And as he started to sit down, I saw him turn to somebody else on the governing council and said, that's a point. That's what we wanted people. We wanted people to be playful and laughing about this, to recognize that, so that it would multiply.
Well, the other really cool thing that Mike did when he came to Broadway was start in worship the lesson from the Contemporary Church. And every Sunday you say...
Every Sunday I say, during this time of worship, every Sunday we have what we call the lesson from the Contemporary Church. It's a time when we remind ourselves that God didn't stop speaking when the book went to press, but continues to write in our lives and stories. And this morning we're inviting, and then we name a person or persons, and they come up. We've met with them during the week. We've worked with them, and they share some story about the way in which they are living out God's call in their life in the world. Usually, not all the time, but usually, this is a person from outside our congregation. We want people to recognize the giftedness, God's abundance in people all around us, but sometimes it's people from within our congregation as well. You wanted me to play the thing, talk about
Yes, well, yeah, play the video. We have an example of, if you go to the Broadway UMC website and go to sermons, every Sunday you can listen to the sermon, but also the lesson from the Contemporary Church.
which is under a separate thing and is much more interesting than
It's much
the
more
sermon.
interesting than the sermon.
Yeah.
So you can go on and get a lot, if you want to go on and learn about this, you can learn and hear more of the stories. But we do have one here today that you did this past
It's
Sunday.
not a video. I think it's an audio,
Yes,
right?
it's an audio.
But what it was because it was remembering our baptism, right? This Sunday, baptism of the Lord. We were celebrating that. We asked people. I had asked 5 people from the 6 people. 5 people and 5 laity and 1 clergy to come and share a very brief thing telling where they were from. It's called Where I Am From. And I gave them the instruction of only 4 to 8 lines. You'll hear that some of them disobeyed that instruction. But it's not, but it's just really moving to hear these people from different backgrounds talk about where they are from, that we are one in baptism. So can we play that? I want to invite the people to come forward now who I've invited to share a little bit during the lesson from the Contemporary Church. So all you who've, yes, Dwayne, you're part of this. Every Sunday, we pause and have this moment we call the lesson from the Contemporary Church. It's a moment when we remind ourselves that God didn't stop speaking when the book went to press, but continues to write in our lives and stories. Come on up behind me here. This morning, I've invited several folks from the congregation to answer the question, where am I from? In a few words, with very different experiences in life, they remind us that we are one. In our difference, in all our beauty, we are one. Dwayne's going to go first.
I am from heartache and hope, from windswept ship decks that scan distant horizons for new beginnings. I am from hot, tangled jungles and a narrow swath of land ripped open by human hands. From that watery scar between 2 oceans, dug shovelful by the sweat-covered backs of brown, black, and yellow men. I am from Carnival in the streets. I am from fiestas in the barrio. I am from arroz con coco, gallina guisada, ropa vieja, from ajo, tomate, cebollo, pimiento, achioto, sazon. I am from sailors and sweethearts, from rough hands and hard work, from wise words and bedtime prayers.
And daily.
Mid-century modern. I am from my mother's intuition, constant, vigilant, and my father's wit, silent, dry. I am from plaid pleated skirts and rosaries and white candles and fish sticks on Friday. I am from suburbs without sidewalks and swimming lessons and story hour at the public library. I am from homework and the honor roll and perfect attendance. I am from compliance and defiance. I am coiled kitten energy and detached feline disdain.
Chris Johnston.
I am castles and kilts, the Highland fling, a monster named Nessie. I am cowboys and rodeos, square dancing, wide open prairies. I am a mile high and a bronco for life, a golden brewery, a rocky college town. I am bay shrimp and a golden bridge, hippies on every corner, techies to the south of me. I am potatoes and international borders, home to the bald eagle migration, logs running the river. I am round ball and race cars. Colts grow to be broncos. Weather is unpredictable. I am proud and thankful. My ancestry, my experiences have made me who I am, who you see.
Fran Quigley.
I am from a home filled with 11 people and not filled with quite enough money to cover us. I am from Catholic parishes and schools with nuns and dusty dogma, but also strong community. I am from afternoons with stacks of books and sports magazines and mornings spent running around with my brothers in circles, chasing glory, but not quite catching it. I'm from a people who dive into their work, especially if it involves a righteous fight. I'm from religious socialism, but we never called it by that name.
Waddell Hamer.
I am from summer afternoons on my dad's lap watching Harry Carey call baseball games. I am from backyard cookouts with old folks listening to old tunes and kids jamming to the new tunes all the same. I am from the region where the realities of being black and poor are greeted with ghetto birds and cherry berry lights. I am a black man who was taught to be as black as the boldness of night. I am a 15-year-old kid who in the span of a year lost his whole world. I'm a young man who regained the world thanks to the love of others. I'm full of as many contradictions and complexities as hip-hop. I am human.
Sondia Graves.
I am from sugar cane, from my mother's land of young. Fresh scents of sage and masala chai. I am the fine threads of Indian saris washed in rivers where local gossip was exchanged. I am of parents daring to uproot the scenery, shake the status quo. I am the pearl in an oyster, imperfectly round, yet smooth like fine bourbon. I'm part of a village, a loving family, created by using my body as a pincushion and willing to do it all again. I am part of the sadness in my father's eyes, his worst diagnosis. I am light and fire, some love, some hate, yet always loyal. I am strength. I am peace. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti.
Holy words, holy wisdom. That's what you wanted people to hear, yes. So again, every Sunday we do something like this. Usually it's one person rather than six, but we had everybody in one worship service on Sunday. Sometimes it's a 9-year-old kid who starts a bike shop out of his garage. And when I ask him to introduce himself, he introduces himself as the CEO of his bike shop. Sometimes it's a 90-year-old woman who's talking about the death of her 2 sons and what she learned from that and what she learned from their deaths. Sometimes it's a 40-year-old woman talking about her struggles with bipolar disorder and how she finds hope and faith in the midst of it. So, I mean, it's a variety of things.
But it's a wonderful way to bring in the gifts and abundance outside of the community into worship.
And it's a lot better than me saying it in the sermon, right? Having people say it, and then I can refer to it.
And people have often said, I mean, I'm sorry, Mike, but that is one of their favorite parts of the worship, is the lesson from the contemporary church. Yeah,
Yes.
and often when someone from the congregation is doing it, you know, afterwards, folks in the congregation have said, I've known that person for 30 years, and I didn't know this about them. It's a beautiful way to
Actually,
tell someone's
because our
story.
work as pastors, one of the things we do a lot of is funerals, right? And one of the things I'm always thinking, and surely you think this when you're meeting with families, is why didn't I know this about this person when they were alive? And I feel like what we do in the lesson from the contemporary church is try to find out what's going on in the lives of people with God before they die, so that we can celebrate it while they're still alive and here present with us. Besides worship, I wanted to talk about one other arena of different structuring. I want to talk about how we did something different with the finance committee one year, because you all come to this to talk about the finance committee, I know. So Rachel and I were sitting with the leadership of the church. It was probably 12 years ago, do you think? Yeah. And we were just like, it was the annual budget meeting, you know, and it was miserable. And it was like, why is it miserable? Why are people, and it was like, oh, they think they're alone. They think they're the only ones who are struggling or thinking about this. So we decided we would hold the meeting at the home of somebody who wasn't a part of our congregation, and that we would ask that person, we asked them to supply a meal and then to tell the people there why they loved Broadway. So we got there and she'd prepared a meal and she said, okay, so I prepared chili for you because I think you're spicy. And I prepared fruit for you because I think you're healthy. And this is what I love about you. And so she talked about this, right? And then we had our budget meeting, but it was a tiny little house that she was sitting in. So though she was sitting in another room, she could hear all our meeting. And at the end of the meeting, she came back out and she said, can I say something else? And he said, sure. She said, well, this makes me really nervous, but because my husband and I have never done this, but can we give you guys some money? And the chair of the finance committee turned to me and said, Mike, are there other people's houses we can hold this meeting at too? Right? And so the next year for our stewardship campaign, we had meals at the homes of people around Indianapolis who were not a part of our congregation, but who loved the witness that we gave in the world. And all we asked them to do was provide a meal and tell the people when they come why you love Broadway, and then just enjoy the meal. It was our most successful financial campaign, was doing that. But it was just a way to, again, recognize the abundance that was around us.
All right, so as I have been preparing for this time, and even this morning, just in reflection, Ephesians chapter 4 came to mind. I kind of want to, as we wrap this up, want to give a word of encouragement from Paul's letter to the Ephesians. And then there's also an ancient proverb that I want to close our time with that will be up on the screen shortly. But in Ephesians chapter 4, Paul writes to the church, he says, so Christ himself gave the apostles, the prophets, the evangelists, the pastors, and the teachers to equip his people for works of service so that the body of Christ may be built up until we all reach unity in the faith and in the knowledge of the Son of God and become mature, attaining to the whole measure of the fullness of Christ. That word service, I kind of want to flip it on its head. That word service for many of us is associated with need. It's associated with us being at the center. But as we leave here, and I know you still have some time here, but where our time is coming to an end with you all, what if the word service is more of to illuminate what already exists among you? What if God has equipped you and has given you to a congregation to help expose what others do not see? In the church, we talk about, depending on what tradition you're from, the fivefold ministry, the apostles, prophet, evangelists, shepherds, teachers, right? Or APEST, depending on, and Alan Hirsch, a theologian, writes extensively about this. But many believe, and I believe this also, that these gifts abide within the congregation. It is not just the clergy that have this gifting, but these gifts exist within the congregation. So for those of us who are considered clergy, if you have the apostolic gift, the prophetic gift, the evangelistic gift, the shepherding gift, or the teaching gift, it's your job to help uncover those gifts within your congregation. So I just wanted to mention that. Many times, again, as clergy, especially if it is your paid profession, and I'm hoping I'm not stepping on any toes here, as someone who doesn't, for years I've done this, I haven't been paid, but definitely felt called to this. Our role is to help uncover these giftings among our people. I know some people who will say, and again, please don't shoot me. I didn't come up with this, right? We may even question the credibility of clergy even being paid if they're not training up others, right? If they're not equipping others to expose the gifts, right? Our role is to equip. Our role is not to be the ones who do all the work, right? So I just wanted to share that. And again, I don't mean to step on any toes. I'm just your Christian cousin that snuck in here.
I don't know, Daryl, do you want to become a United Methodist?
I don't know. Let me talk to
You might have
let me talk to
some,
my superintendent.
You know, we might.
Can we do a ECC Methodist
there might be an
collaboration?
open appointment available.
Is that a thing? Like denominations partner together? That'd be pretty cool. But for real though, I just wanted to share that as an encouragement, but also a little bit of a push. Please don't feel the pressure. And again, I don't know where you're from. I don't know your context. But please, may we feel free and liberated from the idea that we have to be the center. But God has charged you, has equipped you to be an equipper of others, to uncover the gifts and to connect people, to really be about joining God in creating shalom wherever you are. Peace, right? Things being brought back to the way God intended for them to be. So in closing, and unless there was something else, in closing, we have a ancient proverb that I want to read. I have really bad eyesight, so I have to look up at the big screen. But it says this: go to the people, live among them, learn from them, and love them. Start with what they know. Build on what they have. But of the best leaders, when their task is done, the people will remark, we have done it ourselves. I first heard this proverb through the Christian Community Development Association that I've mentioned a few times that I'm a part of. And it's just a powerful idea of us going to learn from the people, being among the people. As I shared, I think I shared with some of the younger clergy on, I don't even know what day it is today. I think it was Tuesday night. I just shared that when I moved into my neighborhood, I just lived among the people for a few years. Again, I know that you can't do that, right? But for me, I worked another job and I did that. I just lived among the people. I guess you could consider me more of a missionary, right? Even though that word is problematic. But that's kind of how my wife and I and my family have lived in a community. And we've just started with what the people have, right? We just asked the question, what can we do with what we have? But what has been beautiful is to see people who would be traditionally labeled, right? People are labeled by society, to see them create, to see them lead. It's been a beautiful thing so that they can truly say, we have done it ourselves. So our hope for all of you is that you can begin to take steps. We know that you have been going on a certain trajectory for a certain amount of time. It's really hard to make this immediate pivot. But what are some simple things that you can introduce to your congregations to uncover the gifts, to magnify the gifts of your people and of your community? Anything else? Can I pray?
Please.
For you all? Lord God, we thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. Lord, we know your spirit is here. Your presence is here among us, in us, moving us, shaping us. We know that your spirit convicts and comforts. So, Lord God, I pray that the conversations we've been having over the last 2 days around asset-based community development, Lord, may you remind us that, first of all, we are made in your image. You have created us with gifts and talents, capacity, dreams, hopes. So, Lord, may we go forward from that place. And, Lord God, may you give us the eyes to see those in our congregation of people full of gifts and talents, Lord, and our communities. Lord, open our eyes to what already exists, Lord, to the abundance that exists around us. Lord, may your will be done in our lives. Lord, may your kingdom come. May your kingdom break out in every single congregation represented here, Lord. May your kingdom break out in every single community represented here, Lord God. May you bless every single family represented here, Lord God. Lord, we pray that your shalom would reign in our hearts, in our lives, and in our neighborhoods. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you all so much.